Hello. Am I am trying to figure out if I'm live. Let me just ask on the chat. Yeah, sure. So I think I'm live. Sorry, we're testing out a new product and we're all about startups. So any glitches, please forgive us. But the idea is to try out new things. Yeah, so many of you already know me. For those of you, who are having a first touch point with me, hi, I'm Akshay Aggarwal. I lead initiatives at Blokchchained India and Blockman Studios. I am a believer in the overall idea of decentralization and strongly think that decentralization is important to drive progress and change. Hence, through both the organizations, I'm promoting mass adoption of Web 3.0 and blockchain based applications. Additionally, I represent Tim Draper's Draper University in India. So, yeah, I'm all about startups, blockchain. Kind of have a heavy inclination towards venture capital, and Blokchchained India was started about 3 years ago. Me and a bunch of other folks in 2016 started it more as a closed door weekly knowledge sharing group, and that was open to everyone in 2017 March, and since then it's become more of a practitioners network dedicated to blockchain and crypto. We have about 20,000 plus members already. We encourage folks to come learn and share about various kinds of skills, opportunities, and projects in the blockchain and crypto space. So we've organized 100 plus meetups, a couple of conferences, multiple roundtable sessions, and now 100 days of code. We're increasingly moving to digital format. So, with the menace of coronavirus, I think we've also got something good in turn when we're able to do this virtually with you all. So yeah, so virtual meetups add to that. We've I personally myself have been sharing some of the vision pieces of what the direction we think for this network should be, and as in when we become more digital, the idea is to get views, feedbacks, hopefully not a lot, but still criticism on our online forums, right? So we're there across multiple channels. We have a website where we have a host of resources, a repository link for people who want to get started in the world of blockchain. There's a section of talks where there are presentations from previous speakers. Then there's a policy report on our website, which came out of a broad show, which saw participation among thousands of people that wanted crypto or had a strong opinion about cryptocurrencies, and about 400 companies ended up coming and participating, and their founders sharing why they think or how they think cryptocurrency should be regulated, right? So these are just a few of those things. We work with some of the top companies into the space, right? So in the past we've hosted Consensus, R3, Stellar, uh, IBM, Algorand, Ripple, Tezos, BitClave, Origin Protocol, and today, it's all about Cosmos, which is an amazing team, an amazing vision, and they're executing super fast. And I'll let the Cosmos India team, take that ahead with the next session. But yeah, so the idea here is to conduct another knowledge sharing session wherein the key focus would be Cosmos, and apart from that, we have some of their affiliated companies, some of our friends from the industry who we consider our experts and have key knowledge about subdomains within the blockchain and crypto paradigm, right? So that's that. And, I'm also associated with Blockchain Studios, where we dedicate ourselves to working with some of the best teams, where we create value aligning with their blockchain visions. So majorly we associate with either of these startups in early stage, help them across their early stage goals. But also we work with these teams that we host at Blokchchained India. And, some of them, majorly most of them are from my network in the past life, or the idea there is to create synergies between these teams and the new startups that are coming along, and help these startups go global on that front. So yeah, I hope you have a wonderful knowledge, a wonderful session. All thanks to the menace of coronavirus, we're doing our first virtual meetup. Something good comes out of it. I hope everybody likes today's session. Hope you all have a great time today and make or take away some learnings or insights from here. Over to you, Manav.
All right, thank you, Akshay. That's how we start our first virtual meetup, guys. Right now, I have three people who are raising their hands to first come questions, guys. These are only to ask questions, so if you are pressing it by mistake, don't do that, because otherwise it can cause some confusion. I will be ending this session and we'll be starting with our next session, which is Introduction to Cosmos with Tushar. Thank you. Hey guys, starting with our first session, which is on Blockchain 3.0 and role of Cosmos. We have the co-founder and CEO for Persistence, Tushar Aggarwal. He's a great friend and a great speaker, and you will learn a lot about Cosmos and the blockchain space from Tushar. Over to you, Tushar.
Thank you, Manav, and thank you, Akshay, for hosting and for the introductory session. I just want to make sure I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible, Tushar.
Yeah. Okay, great. So a big thank you to all the 52 participants that I see that we have on here as well. Like Akshay and Manav mentioned, I guess this is at some level, I don't know if it's the appropriate choice of words, but maybe it's interesting to have this kind of a conference and have, I foresee, I think some people in the chat mentioned that this might become more popular in the future, and I do not disagree. Before jumping into Cosmos and Persistence and what we're doing at Cosmos India, I also want to thank a few people that are joining from overseas. We have Asmodat, who's a very early Cosmos community and very active Cosmos community member. We have Jeffrey from Iris, which is the Chinese hub within Cosmos, and I'll explain what a hub is within the Chinese ecosystem. And all the other speakers, participants, big thank you for taking time out on a Sunday afternoon. Before going into my presentation, I wanted to give a quick introduction about myself. So as Manav said, right now I lead the team at Persistence, and I'm also the co-founder of Cosmos India, which is our nonprofit community initiative. And as for some of you that may be new to the crypto ecosystem, blockchain ecosystem, community is a big part of what makes or breaks a project. And in that context, we try to make a huge effort and push in terms of trying to develop that community, get folks excited about some of the technologies that Cosmos is developing, that we are developing, to see how to drive use cases and get to greater usability and adoption of this technology. Prior to joining Persistence and founding the team, I was involved in my journey in crypto. Started with starting a podcast actually in early 2018. So started investing in crypto kind of end 2016, beginning of 2017. And then kind of throughout 2017, took part in kind of multiple speculative opportunities, as I'm sure some of you here may have done so as well. In 2018, started a podcast called Decrypt Asia, where I would interview different stakeholders in the industry, entrepreneurs, fund managers, exchanges, regulators, and anyone and everyone who is involved in this industry. Started writing for publications like Tech in Asia, which led to me being the first employee at the first properly structured and regulated crypto fund in Singapore called Lunex Ventures, which was the crypto arm of a traditional venture capital fund called Golden Gate Ventures. So Golden Gate Ventures has been investing in traditional startups since about 2011, invested in about 50, 60 companies. They manage about $150 million. And one of the companies that they had invested in on the equity side was a company called Omise, which is a payments company out of Thailand, and which in 2017 did a token sale, which Lunex could not take part in. And so that's how Lunex, which Golden Gate could not take part in. And that was kind of the birth of Lunex, which had a more flexible mandate to invest in both equity, tokens, and it was kind of like a hybrid kind of VC/hedge fund. So was the first employee, was involved in structuring the fund, so working with multiple lawyers, tax advisors, auditors, fund administrators, cybersecurity consultants, regulators, was involved in fundraising, and then did 7 deals in the primary markets. So equity deals, ICOs, and was managing a liquid portfolio of about 8 to 12 tokens. The fund size was about $10 million. And my hypothesis during that whole thing, couple of big high-level hypotheses. One was about India. So if you look at the Indian startup ecosystem, there's about 20 plus unicorns today. About 80% of these unicorns were started after 2010, which was almost 10 to 15 years after similar startups came about in the US and China. So my hypothesis was that something similar was going to happen in crypto and blockchain, just that the lag would not be 10, 15 years, it would be more like 2-3 years. And I think we've seen that thesis kind of play out at some level. Big push on the Indian market. So while I was based in Singapore for almost close to a decade, moved back to India because I just thought the opportunity was really big, and it was too good of an opportunity to not move back. Second hypothesis was more along the lines of the use cases that the industry was going after. So for some of you that may have been, following the industry, today, kind of throughout 2017, 18, 19, a lot of capital was deployed into layer 1 solutions, layer 2 scalability solutions. And for some of you that may not know what layer 1, layer 2 is, I think those are good kind of starting points to start researching about what this industry is about as well. A lot of capital has been deployed into what is called decentralized finance, which is the development of and kind of parallel financial ecosystem, which is relatively more decentralized, relatively more trustless. Gaming, gambling has always been, huge use cases of the internet, but now huge cases within the blockchain industry as well. My thought process was that, if we want, today the market cap is, I haven't been following the exact kind of market cap, but I think somewhere between 150 to 200 billion is the total market cap of all the cryptocurrencies combined. People talk about crypto moving into the trillions of dollars. My thought process, but still, I think crypto remains, highly speculative still. So my thought process is that, if we want to move from this speculative phase to a value creation phase, that happens through the enterprise use case. It takes a little bit longer to bring these enterprises, to explain to them, to evangelize to them, to educate them. It takes a little bit longer, but when they bring in capital, it's a lot bigger than the capital that some of the retail folks bring in. So that's what we are trying to do at Persistence at the moment. So I'll just share my screen.
Tushar, while you share your screen, I just like to make one quick announcement. Guys, raise the hand is to ask questions, which we will be allowing once Tushar's talk is finished. So please don't raise hands before that. So I don't want to disturb Tushar in between till the time he's not ready for his questions. Thank you.
Yeah, what I'll do is, I'll stop like at some intervals within the presentation. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible because I want to spend more time answering questions than kind of having this, one-sided monologue. But essentially, if we talk about, this is a slide that I try to show to a lot of people who, if we really zoom out, if we really take a step back and look at how over the last, thousands of years, how technologies have evolved. There is a concept called of a foundational technology. And what are the properties of foundational technologies? Very simple. One is the end consumer does not need to know how the technology actually works. And the second property is that you can build other technologies on top of it. So very fundamental level, if you look at fire as a technology, we don't need to know the different chemical reactions that are happening. We don't need to know the multiple things that goes into creating a fire, but we can still get the benefits of fire, and other technologies are built on top of it. So we wouldn't have electricity if it wasn't for fire. We wouldn't have PCs if it wasn't for electricity. We wouldn't have the internet if it wasn't for PCs. We wouldn't have smartphones if it wasn't for the internet. But what comes next? And the fundamental thing about each of these is we don't need to know how a monitor works or how a smartphone works or how electricity is produced or distributed or how smartphones are manufactured. All we need to know is, for example, how to switch on a switch off a switch to use electricity, or how to turn on a laptop or turn on or unlock a smartphone and use different applications. And the beautiful thing is you can keep innovating and keep building technologies on top of it. So now we've come across, and if you look at the kind of trend, we're kind of seeing this, scientific revolution happening, especially over the last 500 years, where things have gone, the power laws have come into place and things have, there's been that J curve in terms of the development of technologies, but also creation of new adoption of new technologies. So what's next? And that's kind of how I made my career decision as well in terms of kind of entering crypto. So took a step back and thought about what are the different skill sets that I have, and how can I leverage the skill sets that I have based on what kind of some of the trends in the industry were. And so high level, I think there are 3 or 4 technologies depending on how you classify them. One is obviously we're producing so much data. And so, you want to run predictive models on this data. And so AI ML has, really picked up. We do a lot of hackathons in different colleges, and, most students today want to develop AI ML apps. IoT, as we've kind of been seeing it play before our eyes or experienced it at some level as well. A lot of our devices in everyday usage, whether it's our fridge, whether it's our light bulbs, are starting to become, IoT enabled. And then, a lot these IoT devices, along with the data that we are producing as human beings, or the data that companies are producing, needs to be stored somewhere where there is no central administrator that can come in and manipulate that data, or we want the ability to be able to prove that the data that exists hasn't been tampered with and the provenance is solid or clean. And that's where really blockchain comes in. The second thing is, if we take a step back, again, very macro, what did the internet do for us? Today I can WhatsApp you, WeChat you, send you a snap. I can send you a message on Slack, email you, send you files, data, videos, audio. And essentially, prior to the 1980s, or even until the 1990s, if we had to share information or data, it had to be through, physical files or Telegram and things like that. So what the internet essentially did was bring down heavily the cost of information and data exchange. And what blockchain is trying to do is, trying to do the same for assets. And those assets can be just crypto assets, but it can also be real world assets, like commodities, I don't know if some of you have heard about fractional ownership of real estate, and fractional ownership of paintings, or several other goods that may be a little bit more expensive to own as a whole, or even ownership for things like football teams and things like that. And so essentially the tools that are being used, different consensus protocols, smart contracts, are being used. And the similar tools for the internet were things like HTTP, SMTP protocol, TCP/IP. And so there are a lot of parallels that can be drawn between how the internet was born, what were the verticals that the internet disrupted in the beginning, and who were the users of who were the early users of the internet, to now the kind of disruptions that blockchain is bringing about, or the tools are a little bit different and the verticals disrupted are a little bit different. But I guess at some level, history has been rhyming so far, and it remains to be seen whether it actually plays out that way, or there is actually kind of a shift. Any questions at this stage? Okay.
Yes, there is one question. Yes, Raja. You have a question?
Yeah, is this same as Cosmos SDK, what you're talking about?
No. Right now, just giving context. I'm just going into what Cosmos is, and what Cosmos SDK is, and all of these things. This was just to set context of about the industry and about the thought process behind trying to do something in this industry, and what is this industry capable of.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
I'll someone said make the screen bigger.
Oh, no. So every screen is for everyone. They can make it bigger on their own.
Okay, got it. So, as far as the crypto industry itself is considered, so Bitcoin was born just kind of as the financial crisis, 2008 global financial crisis was taking place. The big use case of Bitcoin was more for, doing transactions, and transactions. It could be cross-border, could be within borders, but the key use case was actual, transfer of money, so to say. And then in about 2015, Vitalik created what is the kind of first smart contract platform, which is Ethereum, where we have, like you have the Bitcoin blockchain itself, but the Ethereum blockchain actually allowed for the creation of applications on top of it. And, there was, and so the entire kind of ICO boom that some of you may have heard of, through 2017, most of that activity, almost all of it was happening on top of Ethereum. And Ethereum itself has kind of evolved to serve kind of different use cases. It was initially kind of the whole ICO mania. Today, if you research about Ethereum, there's not too many ICOs happening. The big use case is decentralized finance, in terms of how can we exchange assets or speculate on assets, or whatever we want to do with our money, whether it's spend it, speculate on it, buy insurance with it, store it, is happening in a relatively more decentralized and trustless manner. So that's what Ethereum kind of tried to do. Ethereum still has certain drawbacks. If you've been looking at the prices past 3-4 days, there was a huge crash. A lot of people were trying to cash out or transfer from one exchange to another, and gas fees skyrocketed, and it was taking almost a little more between 40 to 50 minutes to actually make transfers. And so Ethereum has certain shortcomings in terms of how scalable it is. And so as a result, multiple other smart contract platforms were created. Some of them being kind of more reputable than others. In general, Bitcoin uses the proof of consensus mechanism. Ethereum uses the proof of work consensus mechanism as well. Now what's happening is some of the newer blockchain platforms are using the proof of stake or delegated proof of stake consensus mechanism. But all these different smart contract platforms, all these platforms which enable the development of applications on top of it, whether it's Ethereum or Tron, which is very notorious, or Cardano, Tezos, all of these platforms today exist in silos. So if you build an application on Ethereum, and you have another application on Tezos, for example. Today, they cannot interact with each other. Or if you look at the enterprises, they usually develop applications on some private platforms like Hyperledger, Coda. There is lack of interoperability between these platforms. And so at a very fundamental level, that's the problem that Cosmos tries to solve, where Cosmos is trying to create a layer at the top of all these kind of individual siloed protocols to create a layer of interoperability between these protocols. And so this is kind of, the gentleman who asked the question before talked about Cosmos SDK. Essentially, before talking about Cosmos SDK, how do you ensure that some of the decentralized applications do not get restricted to the chain that they have been built on or that they operate on? And so essentially, at a very fundamental level, that's the problem that Cosmos is trying to solve. And Cosmos is trying to do that, for public as well as kind of, private blockchains. So what is the difference between public and private blockchains? At some level, it's the same as the difference between the internet and the intranet. So today you have large corporations, enterprises saying that, what they said in the 90s as well, saying the internet is cool, but we have our own version of the internet, which is called the intranet, and we're going to control who enters, exits this ecosystem. And so those are kind of private blockchains. They're also called as kind of closed or permissioned or centralized kind of platforms. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum kind of public blockchains, which are relatively more open, decentralized, permissionless. Cosmos itself, how it is structured, it is powered by this general purpose blockchain called Tendermint. Tendermint itself doesn't have a token. So a lot of people are trying to build different things on top of Tendermint. You can create kind of, blockchain platforms which are more private. So for example, Hyperledger is trying to create Hyperledger Burrow, which is powered by Tendermint. Or you can have kind of more, there's one project called Kadena. They're trying to create, for example, Kadena Mint without going into too much complexity. There's a little bit of complexity around that project, but essentially there are multiple projects that are trying to use Tendermint at the consensus layer. And then you have, the SDK itself, and, Deepanshu, who will be, I think, speaking immediately after this, or maybe a couple of slots after this, will be kind of going more into the architecture of Cosmos itself, and what does the Cosmos SDK include, what is the Cosmos Hub, and things like that. Right now, what I want to talk about is just the hub and spoke model. And so essentially what the hub and spoke model is, and I mentioned at the beginning of my conversation that, we have Jeffrey, who is from the China hub. Essentially what Cosmos believes in is, what Ethereum kind of believes in is that you have all applications that sit on kind of one blockchain. At a very fundamental level, what Cosmos believes in is that we'll have, hundreds, if not thousands of different kind of application-specific chains, because each application has unique requirements in terms of what they need to be able to do. So different businesses, different retail use cases, different finance, supply chain use cases will all have kind of very, very dedicated and specialized blockchains. And so they have this model where they have these kind of main big blockchains, which are called hubs. And so Cosmos Hub itself is the first hub within the Cosmos ecosystem. Then you have Iris Hub, which is the China hub. And then you have Persistence, which we, like my first slide said, we are becoming the enterprise hub of Cosmos. Each hub can have multiple zones, which are like, you can call them like, kind of child chains, or you can call them shards, for some of the people who are already in the industry and kind of understand what shards are. And so essentially, at a very high level architecture, the only thing I want you to take away from this slide is that, Cosmos has this kind of hub and spoke model. The hubs are called hubs, the spokes are called zones. And what Cosmos is trying to do is make sure that different hubs can speak to each other. And so essentially what you create using this is an internet of blockchains, where you have kind of multiple blockchains interoperating with each other using what is called IBC. IBC is another protocol, which so IBC itself stands for inter-blockchain communication, and IBC is the protocol that facilitates the speaking of different blockchains to each other. As I mentioned, one of the value propositions of Cosmos, the biggest is obviously interoperability, the ability to have kind of multiple zones. So, it's very fortunate that we saw massive scalability issues in Ethereum just 3-4 days ago. For anyone who holds crypto assets may have experienced, massive kind of throughput issues. One of the things that Cosmos also solves because of its interoperability feature is scalability. And so essentially, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but, like, for example, the interoperability feature itself allows you to maybe, for example, store, metadata on kind of different kind of child chains, for example, and allow them to interoperate between each other, which increases the overall throughput of the network. Application blockchain interface is basically the capability for, developers. So the main language right now is Golang for Cosmos. I think there is a Rust and Haskell implementation being developed or almost developed. And so essentially you can create wrappers, which makes it easier for developers to, code in a programming language that they are comfortable with. The final thing is instant finality. And so this is something that folks who are familiar with, Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains will know as well, in terms of the issues that this causes, and some of the issues that, these are some of the issues that Cosmos itself is trying to address. I don't want to spend too much, time talking about this because I want to entertain some questions, but very quickly, what we are trying to do so this is kind of high-level overview of what Cosmos itself is. In terms of what we're trying to do at Persistence, like I mentioned, we're trying to be the enterprise hub. Our thought process is that similar to the evolution from the intranet to internet, which I mentioned previously as well, and from on-premises servers to the cloud, we believe that there's going to be a movement from private platforms on which enterprise applications reside today to relatively more open, permissionless, public platforms. But this change is not going to happen overnight. Today enterprises love using private blockchains because they can control who enters, exits the ecosystem. They want to keep their transactions private, the application business logic private. But what we believe is that the business case for private blockchains is extremely weak because, essentially people talk about blockchains being immutable, but, they're actually not fully immutable. It really depends on who is controlling the different nodes or who's running the validators, for example, in proof of stake networks. And so what we believe is that, obviously privacy is really important for enterprises, but you still need some level of distributed consensus. You still need some level of third-party validation for the blockchain to actually become powerful. And, the analogy that I always try to draw is that, blockchain is the engine and crypto is the fuel that powers that engine. And without the fuel, there is no point in having the engine. And so essentially what we're trying to create is, we believe that being private or public, being permissioned, permissionless, centralized, decentralized, today it's a very binary narrative. We believe that it's not a very binary outcome. You can have it's a spectrum, and you can move along the different lines of this spectrum. Very high level speaking, and I think, maybe these are the last kind of 2 slides that I'll cover before opening for questions. But in general, there are a few reasons why enterprises do not use public platforms today. And these are the biggest problems that we're trying to solve for as well. Biggest is there is a reluctance to hold tokens or digital assets for multiple reasons. Enterprises, governments haven't figured out how to custodize these assets, how to implement multi-sig. There are regulatory uncertainties with holding digital assets. And then you have to acquire crypto assets to be able to pay for gas. And so these are things that enterprises do not like. In terms of the validators themselves, they don't want fully permissionless environments. They want validators who are at some level KYC'd. In case the validators go malicious, you can have some sort of legal recourse. And then obviously try to keep the privacy of their transactions and the logic. Today, most blockchains allow anyone to become a validator. What the mechanism that we have created, we don't allow anyone to become a validator, but we have very strict onboarding criterias in terms of who becomes a validator. If you don't know who a validator is, think of them like different entities which are globally distributed that are running servers and that are trying to come to consensus on the different transactions that are being broadcasted to them. And so at a very high level, that's what validators are. And these are companies in different geographies around the world that are currently validating for, like the Cosmos Hub itself. They're validating for persistence. A lot of them are validating for Iris Hub as well, for example. And yeah, essentially, we believe that a network is only as strong as its validator set. So if you have a very strong validator set that collectively secure huge amount of crypto assets that have great reputations, then your network keeps getting stronger and stronger. So at this stage, just very quickly, we have a couple of applications that are running in our ecosystem: commodity trading application for trading of social impact bonds, and a couple of other government use cases in the pipeline that we'll kind of talk about as those use cases mature. But that's it from my end. I can probably take 5 minutes for some quick questions. Okay, let me just go through. It keeps going down.
Vinay has a question for you.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tushar. So I was just wondering, you mentioned that if blockchain is the engine, then crypto is something which is like a fuel. So are you suggesting that we can't build any blockchain based applications or things without having crypto at the core of it?
Look, I think it's a journey, right? So today, if you go to a large enterprise or if you go to a government agency and you tell them to have crypto, they're going to laugh you out of the room. But at some level, you need some level of distributed consensus. So one of the examples that I try to give is you need some level of distribution in terms of the validation that is happening. So for example, for some of the applications that we're running, our validator set is actually distributed around the world. But say you start developing an application for a government. Most governments have today policies or regulations in place which don't allow them to send data overseas. So in that case, what we'll say is, some government agencies will come to us and be like, can we run all the validators ourselves because we want to keep the data within our organization? And so we try to explain to them that there is no point in having a blockchain because tomorrow, if you make a mistake, then you can actually roll back the blockchain. You can roll back the transactions. And so there is no point in having a blockchain because you might as well use a database. So you need some level of distributed consensus with some level of incentives involved, as someone has written in the chat as well. Now, those incentives, in the short term can be implemented through, without having crypto. So, for example, if you have one government agency at the central government level that is trying to create a blockchain-based solution, then you can tell them, okay, instead of you running all the nodes or validators, maybe you can have certain state governments that you trust to run some of the validators and incur some expenses to run these servers, and you can pay them. You can create some incentive mechanisms. And so again, what we believe is, like I mentioned, it's you need to make a push for having greater distribution in terms of how the validation happens, along with certain incentives as you kind of keep going along. But this journey is not going to be kind of overnight. Someone in the chat says blockchain without crypto is like trying to separate a gin and tonic. Why would you do it? But essentially, again, that's why we say that, it's a spectrum, being, private or public. What we try to explain, what we try to evangelize to some of the larger corporations, to some of the government agencies, is that you need some level of distributed consensus. And I think they themselves are starting to realize that, you need some level of distributed consensus, because if you're controlling all the nodes, then you may as well not have a blockchain. And it took some time for people to start having this realization.
Okay. So in terms of having power, like having responsibilities also distributed.
Yeah. One question from the chat.
Okay.
So yeah, over a period of time, our goal is to try and see how to, maybe increase the size of the validator set as well. So today the validators get paid once there is greater economic activity for the different applications. So one of the biggest things that we are trying to do is ensure that there is enough economic activity happening in the different applications, so that the validators have incentives to run, infrastructure, spend manpower, and things like that. So our goal over a period of time will be to try and increase the validator set, to try and make it more permissionless, so that other stakeholders can start joining in as well. But one of the biggest reasons why we keep a relatively permissioned environment is because we require all our validators to run physical servers with hardware security modules and things like that. Just because the kind of nature of transactions that they're validating are high value transactions. So just from a security perspective at the moment. Polkadot, is a good question. So Polkadot is a big competitor to Cosmos. And Polkadot is itself at the moment not live. So Cosmos is one of the first kind of interoperability projects out there that is live. It's one of the first major proof of stake projects that is live. But we've been deeply looking into Polkadot and its workings as well. I think big difference between Polkadot is actually, if you are familiar with how Ethereum 2.0 is trying to migrate from proof of work to proof of stake, Polkadot is trying to create a very, very similar structure. One big difference between Cosmos and Polkadot is the Polkadot has shared security. So every new zone or every new hub doesn't have to onboard a new set of validators, for example. But I think Deepanshu will go into more detail on the technical side in terms of what some of the key differences between Cosmos and Polkadot is going to be.
Tushar, before you let Bharat ask his question, can you stop your screen sharing so that we can have the speaker's face visible? Perfect. Thank you. Bharat, over to you.
Hi, Tushar. So considering that, the network sort of remains a validator-based, a federated validation group, considering that the identity of these nodes is known, how do you think this will affect? You are using HSMs and all that is fine, but if you are, this group of validators is attacked by an army of hackers, right? For example, China has so many of them. So how would this be taken care of?
Look, I think, our thought process, so I think validators can be attacked in a completely permissionless setting as well. So the attack is not based on whether the validators are, federated or kind of, fully permissionless. For example, in Cosmos has about 125 validators. Our thought process for having a very curated set of validators, like I mentioned, the validators in our ecosystem are validating real world banking transactions, and the actual value of these transactions can be very, very significant. And so we didn't, today people talk about, for example, centralization of proof of work mining in China, for example. What proof of stake networks or delegated proof of stake networks, they've managed to achieve geographical decentralization. But what has happened is a lot of these validators actually run in the cloud. And so you have infrastructure centralization of most validators running in the cloud. And so if there is a multi-region outage, which has happened a couple of times. Like I think in June of last year, Google Cloud went down, and I think 10% of the Cosmos validators went down with it. So in order to prevent it, and if you are a large enterprise, you don't want that kind of downtime. And so in order to prevent situations like these, in the interim, while there are best practices that start getting defined for what is the infrastructure that is required to run validators, we are trying to make sure that while having distributed consensus through these, curated validators, we still ensure that there is certain quality of validators that is maintained in terms of the physical infrastructure that they're using, in terms of the experience that they have. So we don't want, like, for example, random kids sitting in their parents' basement running validators in the cloud while you have millions of dollars of transactions happening at the application layer. So that's kind of our high-level thought process of why we have designed the mechanism in the way that we have designed.
Thanks.
Any other questions we have for Tushar? Tushar, there is a guy who's asking in comments.
Yeah. So at the moment, so our criteria is, like I said, the criteria for being a validator is, qualitatively. So it's qualitative and quantitative. Qualitatively, the criteria that we look at are what is your general reputation, and that reputation could be a function of your contribution to open source code, your contributions to the community in general, and quantitatively or more concretely, it's based on the assets under delegation. So we try to make sure that each of our validators has a minimum assets under delegation of $15 million, and that they run physical servers with HSM, so they don't run in the cloud. The token economics, we're still in the process of defining. We think that's something that would be a little difficult for me to discuss publicly at this stage.
Anyone else wants to ask a question, they can raise their hands and ask a question. All right.
We're working on different kinds of use cases. Very high level speaking, the use cases that we're focusing on requires the representation of any real world assets. So if you look at the use cases that we've already worked on, so Comdex, for example, is a physical commodities marketplace. IXO is a marketplace for trading of social impact bonds. So we try to go after use cases where there is a real world asset involved. That real world asset could be a commodity, a social impact bond, it could be stocks, FX, anything. And essentially, that is the biggest use case that we're going after. For some of you that may be familiar with, blockchain and crypto, we represent these real world assets through NFTs.
Perfect. Tushar, Raja has a question, and I guess after that we'll move on to the next session. Raja, please.
Yeah, you mentioned about, it is like, Internet of Blockchains is Cosmos SDK, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't catch that. I was reading the chat.
Yeah, Cosmos is trying to enable, Internet of Blockchains.
Yeah.
So does it mean that, they will, every new blockchain which comes up, would they give a different SDK or some generalized SDK is good enough?
Yeah. So, so the Cosmos SDK is a very, very general purpose SDK that allows for, it has a couple of modules. I think Centcoin being one of them. There's a couple of other modules. And the Cosmos SDK itself is being expanded as we speak. But for example, the persistence SDK, because it is more enterprise focused, we have developed functionalities which are more enterprise friendly. And so we sat down and thought about what are the different functionalities that when there's a buyer and seller, what are the different functionalities that they would need. So we have things like identity, reputation management, access rights management, escrow, settlement. We have our own version of NFTs, like I mentioned earlier. So those are some of the modules within our SDK. And so different people can create their own SDKs based on the use cases that they're trying to go after. And so essentially, right now it's closed source, but in the future, we plan to make it open source. I think there's some aspect of it which is open source. Essentially, anyone can start using these modules. You don't have to create a new SDK from scratch if you don't want to. I think there's a lot of code that has already been done, not just by us, but by multiple other teams. But it's just that from our perspective, the specific use cases that we were going after, we thought it was best to create some of these functionalities that we thought were very, very specific to the use cases that we were going after.
So, but would these SDKs implemented by different vendors, something like, I come from a Java world, where, see, from a programmer perspective, JDBC is started.
Okay, and what's your question?
Yeah, basically, is Cosmos SDK trying to bring in, if you write in using Cosmos SDK, I should be able to communicate, without worrying about who is the blockchain provider. Is that it is trying to do?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So right now there is a Go implementation of the Cosmos SDK, and like I said, people are trying to create Rust and Haskell implementations in the future, and this is something that we have thought about as well in terms of having a Java implementation. So that, in the future, you don't have to go out and learn, Go, for example. And I think, I'm not sure if that was your question as well, but in general, yeah.
I meant, yes, let's say any language. I have an SDK and an implementation of, that SDK in that language. Now, using that, and if I write a blockchain, CRUD operations, would that work with, Ethereum as well as future blockchains which will come in?
Sure. So, at some level, once those bridges have been built, so I talked about, IBC, inter-blockchain communication. Right now, a lot of the bridges between, for example, Ethereum and Cosmos, or Bitcoin and Cosmos, or Zcash and Cosmos, or, for example, Hyperledger and Cosmos have not been built, but it is up to, since it's a completely open source project, if you want to build those bridges, you can build those bridges, or you can kind of wait for those bridges to be built so that you can start, for example, if you build something in Hyperledger, but you want to kind of plug into, or like, for example, you have your own version of NFTs within Hyperledger, but you want to facilitate asset exchange with NFTs that reside maybe in the Cosmos ecosystem, and you want these NFTs to be interoperable, for example, then you would have to wait for those bridges to be built, or like build a bridge yourself. But these are some things that we are focused on as well, because, a big thing that we're trying to do is bridge private blockchains to public blockchains. And so it is in our interest at some level to create those bridges as well.
Okay, so Persistence is supporting what kind of bridges, or so far?
Right now, none of the bridges have been built. I mean, Cosmos itself is, in its infancy. I think IBC itself, inter-blockchain communication itself, is under development. I think they're trying to do like an incentivized testnet for IBC itself, which is called Game of Zones, in the next kind of 4 to 6 weeks. And then once that gets stable, I think that's when a lot of the kind of interoperability features will start going live. But the interoperability features are not live at the moment. Like Abhitej said, I think, Peggy is something where there's one team that is trying to create bridges between Ethereum and Cosmos. And so you have, they're trying to create this module which uses Tendermint at the consensus layer, but on top you have EVM actually. And so those kind of bridges are being built, but it's still super, super early and super nascent at the moment.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Tushar, for the great session and for such insightful information regarding Cosmos and what you guys are doing. I will be ending this session and we'll be starting our next session where we'll be learning more in deep about Cosmos tech. Thank you, Tushar.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.